Modern pessimism, around the period 1850 to 1945, was an artistic and philosophical movement to counter idealistic philosophies like Marxism and Romanticism. An overview of pessimism. This movement came from the realization that the romantic ideal was unattainable. It came from the decline of Romanticism, and it focuses on the reality of the everyday man. This movement is not focused on negative pessimism, which is the contrarian, fatalistic pessimism that does not benefit anyone. It is a movement of pessimism that strengthens mental fortitude in anticipation of things to come and the reality of the world, which is not a glamorous or perfect utopia. Philosophical pessimism was first coined by Arthur Schopenhauer, a famous German philosopher who laid the foundation for the movement in the 1800s. Although it can be considered a negative or fatalistic philosophy, it helps to develop emotional resilience and a deeper gratitude for life.
Arthur Schopenhauer lived from 1788 to 1860. He is considered the founder of pessimistic philosophy. His most famous work is The World as Will and Representation, and he's most infamous for On Women. Schopenhauer was a German philosopher who developed an atheistic, metaphysical, and ethical system that has been described as exemplary manifestation of philosophical pessimism. Emile Cioran lived from 1911 to 1955. He published works in both Romanian and French. His works have been noted for philosophical pessimism and they engage with the issues of suffering, decay, and nihilism. Among his best-known works are On the Heights of Despair in 1934 and The Trouble of Being Born in 1973. Cioran's first French book, A Short History of Decay, was awarded the prestigious Rivarol Prize in 1950. Giacomo Leopardi lived from 1798 to 1837. All'Italia and Sopra il Monumentum di Dante marked the beginning of his series of major works. Leopardi tried to escape his oppressive living as a child by traveling to Rome, but was caught by his dad. In this era, his personal pessimism evolved into his philosophical pessimism. Edward von Hartmann was a German philosopher who lived from 1842 to 1906. His reputation as a philosopher was established by his first book, Philosophy of the Unconscious. Its success came from its originality of the title, diversity of its contents, and fashionable pessimism. Oh, wait, 2 slides there. Whoops. I don't know what happened. Friedrich Nietzsche, if that's how you say it, 1844 to 1900. Instead of supporting pessimism, he challenged the works of the other pessimistic philosophers. He published a series of 4 essays collectively known as Untimely Meditations, and the purpose of these were written to challenge the pessimistic ideas. T.S. Eliot lived from 1888 to 1965. He lived through most of the modernist movement and was one of the most influential poets/playwrights in the 20th century. His most famous work was The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which was considered a masterpiece of modernistic movement. He had a Ph.D. from Harvard as a philosopher and specifically was known for his works of pessimism like The Wasteland, where he expresses a frustration for the future lives that people could have lived that died in World War I. His pessimism was based on loneliness, boredom, and emptiness of the 20th century that many people felt. Ernest Dowson lived from 1867 to 1900. He was an influential English poet and novelist who was associated with the pessimism movement and the decadent movement. His famous quote, "They are not long, the days of wine and roses," encapsulates his thoughts on romanticism and the reality of life and sadly these words foreshadow his early death. His works are very pessimistic and sorrowful.
The decadent movement, uh, as the decadent movement in Latin is a word that means decline. The movement was characterized by self disgust, sickness at the world, general skepticism, and a loathing for the loss of cultural standards. This parallels with the pessimism movement in the same time period and shares almost the exact same views that the romanticism and indulgence of self philosophies sac- sacrifice people's moral character for the sake of their pleasure. Both movements target the idolization and indulgence of self and consider it as damaging to society. Conclusion. Pessimism in the 19th and 20th century was a complex movement, first started by the philosopher Schopenhauer. It was a philosophy that was manifested in many different works of poetry and literature over that time period, but it cannot be limited to a specific genre. Overall pessimism in this period challenged movements like the Industrial Revolution, Marxism, and Romanticism by asking whether the life in the modern world was truly better. T.S. Eliot said people living in the modern world are spiritually dead, and that our psychological state is very fragile. This challenged the idea at the time that we are living in the best possible time, and this lesson is still applicable to the world currently, as the wealthiest people don't always achieve happiness. These are our works cited.